It was the winter of 1955, and the Arctic sky above Alaska burned with a pale, metallic light. The Cold War had entered one of its most anxious phases, a season when silence itself seemed dangerous and the faintest sound could set nations trembling. In the early hours of a November morning, inside a radar station near Fairbanks, a group of young airmen stared at their glowing green screens and saw something they could not explain, a formation of fast-moving echoes, hundreds of miles north, closing in from the direction of the pole. At first, no one spoke. The operators watched in uneasy stillness as the dots multiplied and thickened, flickering across the radar scope like a storm of ghosts. Then came the calls to Anchorage, to Seattle, to Colorado Springs. Within minutes, teletypes began to chatter. Across the continent, the U.S. Air Defense Command was waking up to the possibility that the long-expected moment had arrived, a Soviet attack, silent and unstoppable, emerging from the endless night above the Arctic Circle. Outside, the wind howled across frozen runways. Inside, the air smelled of coffee and ozone. Officers barked orders over the hum of machines, demanding cross-checks, confirmation, verification. The radar readings were clear, the instruments stable. Whatever was up there, it was real enough to trigger alarms from Alaska to Montana. At Strategic Air Command headquarters in Omaha, a red phone rang in the operations center. General Curtis LeMay, the architect of America's nuclear bomber fleet, was roused from his quarters and briefed within minutes. The report was precise and terrifying, unidentified objects heading south at high altitude, traveling faster than known aircraft, maintaining tight formation. Every instinct, every plan rehearsed since 1949, pointed to one conclusion: the Soviets were making their move. LeMay's reaction was typical of the man: cold, efficient, deliberate. He ordered nuclear-armed B-47s prepared for takeoff. Runways across the northern states flared to life as floodlights pierced the dark, illuminating lines of sleek bombers waiting for instructions that might decide the fate of humanity. In the Pentagon, tension mounted. Analysts pored over incoming data, seeking any sign that the radar readings might be false, atmospheric reflection, perhaps, or a magnetic anomaly caused by solar flares. But the patterns were too consistent, too deliberate. Across the Atlantic, the British Air Ministry began coordinating its own alerts. The North American continent stood at the edge of DEFCON 3, and no one knew exactly why. To understand the panic, one must remember the world as it was then. Only a decade earlier, Hiroshima and Nagasaki had shown what atomic fire could do. By the mid-1950s, both superpowers possessed enough nuclear weapons to destroy civilization several times over. Communication between Washington and Moscow was fragile, filtered through diplomats and suspicion. In such an atmosphere, every radar blip was a potential apocalypse. As the hours passed, tension spread beyond the control rooms. Fighter pilots sat strapped into their cockpits, engines idling, waiting for the scramble order. Families in distant towns heard the air raid sirens and looked toward the northern sky, half expecting to see the glare of falling stars. Radio stations broke into programming with emergency bulletins about unusual aerial activity. And yet, in the midst of this rising panic, a few calm voices urged restraint. At Alson Air Force Base, a seasoned radar technician named Sergeant William Broderick noticed something odd. The echoes were not behaving like aircraft. Their paths wavered slightly, drifting rather than slicing across the grid. Their altitudes fluctuated by thousands of feet within seconds, impossible for jet engines to sustain. He marked the readings, recalibrated his console, and called for an independent scan from a second site. When the second radar returned identical data, uncertainty turned to dread. Broderick's commanding officer ordered a high-altitude reconnaissance flight to intercept whatever was intruding on American airspace. 2 F-89 Scorpion jets lifted into the dark, climbing through the thin Arctic air toward the unknown. The pilots strained their eyes against the night, searching for movement, light, or shadow. What they saw, or thought they saw, only deepened the mystery. Above the cloud line, faint points of silver drifted in the jet stream, hundreds of them, glinting briefly in the sun before vanishing into the haze. To the pilots, they looked like distant aircraft, maybe even missiles. They radioed the sighting to command, and that confirmation was enough. Across the network, alarms solidified into certainty. In those minutes, the United States stood balanced on a knife's edge, one order away from launching the bombers that would end the world. No one yet understood that the invaders were nothing more than weather balloons, caught in high-altitude winds and magnified by radar into an armada of phantom enemies. But that realization would come later. For now, the false signal had done its work. The machinery of apocalypse had stirred, and for the first time, America felt the cold breath of its own fear. In the early hours before dawn, the world inside America's defense network began to hum with controlled chaos. The alarm from Alaska had rippled eastward like an electric current, jumping from base to base, from one secure line to the next. By the time the sun rose over Washington, D.C., the U.S. military machine was already grinding into motion. Inside the Pentagon's underground war room, staff officers crowded around situation maps covered with red and blue markers, tracing possible flight paths of the supposed intruders. Every 10 seconds, new coordinates arrived from radar outposts across the Arctic line, confirming the same eerie pattern, multiple unidentified contacts heading steadily south. In Colorado Springs, the newly operational Continental Air Defense Command, CONAD, scrambled its analysts from sleep. Coffee cups rattled on steel tables as men in uniform argued over data they barely understood. The oscilloscopes flickered, the teletypes clacked, and the air smelled of hot circuitry and cigarette smoke. To the generals, the implications were unbearable. The Soviets might have found a new route over the pole, bypassing early warning systems entirely. If that was true, the United States had only minutes before bombers reached the northern cities, Seattle, Minneapolis, maybe even Chicago. Across the country, phones began to ring in homes belonging to men whose decisions could destroy nations. In Omaha, General Curtis LeMay stood over a glowing situation board, arms crossed, his jaw locked in thought. To his staff, he looked like a statue of iron, unmoving, expressionless, but radiating a terrible resolve. LeMay had built the Strategic Air Command on one principle: readiness without hesitation. If the Soviets struck first, retaliation had to be automatic. There would be no time for debate, no room for doubt. Now, as he watched the markers creeping across the polar grid, he faced the decision he had trained his entire life to make. LeMay ordered nuclear bombers to their alert stations. Across a dozen bases, klaxons wailed and red lights flashed in concrete corridors. Crews raced from dormitories to flight lines, pulling on pressure suits and helmets as engines coughed to life in the icy dark. The ground trembled under the roar of jet turbines. Each aircraft carried enough firepower to erase a city, and each pilot knew what the order to launch would mean, not just for the enemy, but for the world. In Washington, the Pentagon switchboard blinked with frantic activity. Defense Secretary Charles Wilson was briefed by aides who could barely conceal their alarm. Should they wake the president? The question hung in the air like a live wire. Eisenhower was known for calm judgment, but to wake him meant escalation, a formal recognition that the United States might be under attack. If it turned out to be nothing, the embarrassment would echo across the globe. Yet if it were real, hesitation could cost millions of lives. Reporters had begun to pick up whispers. A teletype operator at the Associated Press overheard part of a defense transmission and noted the words polar incursion. Within the hour, small radio stations from Anchorage to San Francisco interrupted their broadcasts with vague bulletins. Unidentified aircraft have been detected over northern airspace. Civilians, hearing the words without context, panicked. Some packed cars, others called relatives in distant states, fearing that nuclear sirens might sound at any moment. Back in Alaska, radar operators continued to track the Phantom fleet. The echoes were multiplying, merging into a dense swarm that seemed to cover hundreds of miles. At times, entire clusters vanished, only to reappear seconds later. Technicians checked cables, retuned frequencies, even replaced cathode tubes, but the images persisted. One frustrated officer muttered that the machines themselves were lying, and for the first time that night, his words didn't sound entirely foolish. The atmosphere in every command post was thick with tension. Decisions that could end the world now depended on flickering green lines and the judgment of exhausted men. One colonel in Colorado, his voice steady but brittle, summarized the dilemma: if we're wrong, we start a war. If we're right, and we wait too long, we lose one. Then came a second wave of reports, sightings from commercial pilots flying routes over the Pacific, claiming to see faint metallic glints far above their altitude. The accounts were vague, inconsistent, and yet they matched the radar data too perfectly to ignore. For many commanders, that was enough to erase doubt. Orders went out to raise readiness again. DEFCON levels dropped to 3. The next step, if confirmed, would be general mobilization. And still, amid the noise, a handful of officers hesitated. At Eielson, Sergeant Broderick reviewed the radar feed once more and noticed that the objects were not moving in formation anymore. Their speed varied wildly, sometimes increasing beyond any known capability, sometimes halting altogether. He contacted his superior and proposed a theory that the signals might not be aircraft at all, but something lighter, drifting with the winds. His superior dismissed it. The stakes were too high for theories. But Broderick persisted. He requested permission to verify through optical tracking, sending 2 pilots already airborne to climb above the cloud layer and look directly toward the contacts. The authorization came reluctantly. As the jets ascended, the entire defense network held its breath. For several long minutes, no one spoke. When the pilots finally broke radio silence, their words came calm but uncertain: visual confirmation, multiple reflective objects, appear stationary, possibly balloons. Silence fell across the command center. Somewhere, an officer exhaled for the first time in an hour. The unimaginable had almost happened, and it had all begun with a patch of static on a radar screen. At 30,000 feet above the Arctic, the air was thin and bright, and the world below stretched endless and white. The 2 interceptor jets, their silver bodies glinting against the morning sun, moved through pockets of turbulence as their pilots scanned the horizon. What they found defied belief. Suspended in the upper atmosphere, drifting lazily in the jet stream, floated dozens, perhaps hundreds, of gleaming silver spheres. Some were solitary, others clustered in loose formations, turning slowly with the wind. They were not aircraft, not missiles, not weapons of any kind. They were weather balloons. The pilots circled once, twice, then radioed back their report. On the other end of the transmission, the command center erupted in disbelief. Officers leaned over consoles, struggling to comprehend how something so innocent could have triggered a military crisis. Confirmation came from additional flights. The objects were high-altitude balloons, likely released by meteorological research stations in Japan or the Pacific, carried thousands of miles by the polar jet stream. What made them so dangerous, however, wasn't the balloons themselves, it was the way radar had seen them. At those altitudes, thin layers of warm and cold air created echoes that distorted the radar image, amplifying each balloon's reflection until it looked like an aircraft, or a formation of them. The Arctic night, charged with magnetic interference, had completed the illusion. To machines designed to detect bombers, it looked like an invasion. When the truth reached the upper command, relief mixed uneasily with embarrassment. No one wanted to be the first to say it aloud, but every man in the room understood what had just happened. The world had come within minutes of a nuclear counterstrike because of balloons. General LeMay's reaction was characteristically blunt. He ordered a full review of radar calibration and communications protocol, then instructed his staff to seal the incident's details under classified orders. There would be no public acknowledgement, no press release, no trace of the panic that had swept through America's defense grid. To the outside world, nothing had happened. But within the steel corridors of the Pentagon and the command bunkers of Strategic Air Command, the lesson was carved deep. In Alaska, exhausted radar operators slumped in their chairs, staring at the fading traces on their screens. Some laughed nervously, others simply removed their headsets and sat in silence. They had followed every procedure, done everything right, and yet their instruments had nearly betrayed them. One of them murmured, "We almost ended the world because of the weather." The military quickly traced the source of the balloons. They belonged to a series of high-altitude atmospheric experiments launched by a scientific collaboration between Japan and the United States, part of an international study on upper wind currents. The irony was bitter. The very nation America had fought a decade earlier was now unwittingly sending instruments that almost triggered Armageddon. In the following days, teams of scientists and intelligence officers were quietly dispatched to investigate. They found fragments of latex and aluminum scattered across frozen plains, tangled in treetops and antenna masts. Each piece told the same story, a harmless object mistaken for an existential threat. But the more they examined the data, the more troubling it became. The radar system had worked exactly as designed. It had detected unidentified flying objects, plotted their trajectory, and raised the alarm. The failure wasn't mechanical, it was psychological. The nation had been conditioned to expect the worst. In press rooms and political offices, the event was never discussed. Classified memoranda circulated under code names that disguised their meaning: Polar Echo, Operation Mirage. The phrase weather anomaly became the convenient explanation whenever radar reports grew inconveniently strange. And though the story faded from official memory, its impact remained. Engineers began drafting blueprints for a new kind of defense network, one that would distinguish natural phenomena from real threats, a chain of colossal radar sites that would stretch across the Arctic, monitoring the skies with unprecedented precision. Late that night, in the quiet after the emergency had ended, one of the radar technicians stepped outside the operations building. The wind had calmed, and above him the stars burned with icy brilliance. For a moment, he thought he saw a faint silver speck drifting against the constellations, catching the moonlight as it turned. He couldn't tell whether it was another balloon or simply a trick of the eye. But the sight lingered with him, the absurd beauty of it, the fragility, and the knowledge that such a small thing could nearly destroy everything he loved. Inside, the base intercom crackled one last time: "Stand down alert. Resume normal operations." The words were simple, almost casual, yet every man who heard them understood their weight. The crisis was over. The danger, for now, had passed. But deep down, they all knew that the sky would never feel entirely safe again. In the uneasy calm that followed the 1955 balloon incident, the American military found itself facing a question it had tried to ignore since the dawn of the nuclear age: how do you defend a nation when your own technology can deceive you? The near disaster had exposed more than faulty radar, it had revealed the fragility of an entire system built on faith in machines. Every general, every radar officer, every scientist who reviewed the night's data came to the same conclusion: the next time, the warning might be real. Within weeks, the Pentagon convened a series of high-level meetings, held in soundproof rooms under layers of security clearance. Charts, maps, and radar plots covered the walls. The tone was grim but determined. If the Cold War was to be won, or even survived, America needed an eye that could see clearly across the entire Northern Hemisphere, a warning system too vast and too sophisticated to be fooled by balloons or clouds or moonlight. From that urgency was born one of the most ambitious defense projects in human history, the Ballistic Missile Early Warning System, or BMEWS. Construction began quietly, without public announcement. In remote tundra outposts from Alaska to Greenland, convoys of heavy machinery carved foundations into permafrost. Gigantic radar domes, each the size of a cathedral, rose against the horizon, their white shells gleaming in the polar sun. Engineers worked in sub-zero temperatures, welding steel under flares of orange light that danced across the frozen plains. Inside those domes, the most advanced electronics of the era took shape: vast arrays of antenna panels, oscillators, and high-frequency receivers capable of tracking objects half a continent away. For the scientists and soldiers stationed there, life blurred into a ritual of precision. Every day brought calibration drills, signal tests, and endless lines of coded transmissions. In their isolation, they joked that they were listening to ghosts, but they all knew the truth: if their instruments ever detected the wrong kind of echo, there would be no time to joke. The system they were building wasn't just for detection, it was for judgment, for deciding within seconds whether the world would live or burn. In Washington, defense planners heralded the network as a triumph of engineering. But behind the optimism lay unease. The new system could see farther than any before it, yet it depended even more heavily on automation, computers interpreting signals faster than humans could think. For the first time, the decision to respond to an attack would rely as much on algorithms as on generals. The idea thrilled some and terrified others. What if the machines made a mistake? What if another balloon, another reflection, triggered a sequence of alerts that no one could stop in time? To prevent that, a doctrine of redundancy and verification was introduced. No single radar could start a war. Every warning had to be confirmed by multiple stations, analyzed by human eyes, and verified by satellite imagery once those technologies arrived years later. Still, veterans of the 1955 scare remained skeptical. They knew how fear warped reason. They had seen officers reach for phones with trembling hands, ready to call in nuclear strikes over flickers on a screen. By the early 1960s, the northern defense chain stretched like an invisible wall around the continent. From the DEW line in Alaska to Thule Air Base in Greenland and RAF Fylingdales in England, its radars pulsed day and night, scanning the heavens for signs of Soviet missiles. The sound of those pulses, steady, rhythmic, mechanical, became the heartbeat of the Cold War. For a generation of technicians, the balloon panic was quietly buried under classified files and training manuals. But they never forgot. In their mess halls, under the drone of fluorescent lights, stories circulated of the night the world almost ended over a misunderstanding. The younger recruits laughed, the older men did not. To them, it was a ghost story told not to entertain but to warn. In time, the public learned fragments of what had been built in their name: massive radar domes, sprawling command bunkers, the mythic Shield of the North. Magazines printed sanitized photographs of the installations, praising the ingenuity of American science. None mentioned that the project had been born from panic, from the terror of a night when radar mistook the wind for an enemy fleet. Years later, one of the engineers who had overseen construction in Alaska was interviewed for a declassified report. When asked what he remembered most about the project, he paused for a long moment before answering. "It wasn't the machines," he said quietly. "It was what they meant. We were building faith that we'd know the truth before the world ended." And yet, as history would soon prove, even the most advanced eyes in the sky could still be deceived. For all its grandeur and precision, the shield America built in the Arctic would one day face the same ghost it had tried so desperately to banish: a false alarm, born of reflection and chance, that would once again bring the world to the edge of annihilation. By the early 1960s, the radar domes of the ballistic missile early warning system stood like silent sentinels across the top of the world. Inside their hollow shells, giant antennas swept the skies in slow, deliberate arcs, transmitting invisible waves into the darkness. To those who worked within them, the constant hum of the machinery became a kind of lullaby, a reminder that vigilance never slept. But beneath that hum lay something else, the unspoken fear that one day, the signal they detected would not be a phantom. The lesson of the balloon panic had been absorbed, written into manuals, protocols, and training films, but time eroded memory. The men who had once stared down false echoes were replaced by new recruits, younger, faster, and more confident in the infallibility of their systems. The technology had improved, the computers were faster, the radars sharper. Yet the same human frailty remained, hidden under layers of confidence. And soon enough, history repeated itself. It happened in October 1960, at Thule Air Base in Greenland, one of the crown jewels of the new warning system. The operators on duty that night watched in disbelief as their screens erupted with signals, dozens of missile trajectories, all rising from the heart of the Soviet Union. The system interpreted them as an all-out nuclear strike. The alarms blared, the red phones came alive, and the men followed procedure with mechanical precision. Within minutes, Strategic Air Command was on high alert, and bomber crews raced toward their aircraft. But then someone noticed something peculiar. The reported missiles weren't following realistic paths, their flight angles were too steep, their speeds inconsistent. A young officer hesitated before relaying the final confirmation. He double-checked the radar's calibration data, comparing it to astronomical charts pinned to a wall. Then came the realization that missiles were rising from the horizon where the moon had just appeared. The radar had mistaken the moon's reflection for a mass launch. Once again, humanity had been saved by a moment of doubt. The base commander ordered the alert cancelled. The bomber engines were shut down, the red phones went silent, and the tension dissolved into uneasy laughter. In the official record, the incident was described as anomalous radar returns. But to those who were there, it was another ghost from 1955, proof that the instruments they trusted could still lie. The following decades brought new versions of the same nightmare. In November 1979, at NORAD headquarters in Colorado, a technician accidentally inserted a training tape into the main computer that controlled America's early warning system. The simulation displayed a massive Soviet nuclear attack, hundreds of warheads inbound, spreading across North America like falling stars. Within minutes, the data flashed through command networks, triggering preparations for retaliation. Air Force bombers began to taxi down the runway. Crews armed the nuclear codes. It took only one skeptical officer, noticing the perfect symmetry of the attack, to halt the chain of command and verify the source. When the truth emerged, that it was merely a test scenario, the command center fell into stunned silence. A simple human error had nearly brought the world to the edge again. In September 1983, it was the Soviets' turn. Their own early warning system reported the launch of 5 American missiles. The man on duty that night, Lieutenant Colonel Stanislav Petrov, faced a choice that mirrored countless American dilemmas before him. The computers insisted the data was real. The protocol demanded immediate escalation. But Petrov hesitated. He reasoned that no rational enemy would begin a nuclear war with only 5 missiles. He labeled the alarm as false and refused to pass the report up the chain. His decision, quiet, defiant, and profoundly human, prevented a global catastrophe. By the time the Cold War began to thaw in the late 1980s, the men who had once watched the skies for signs of the end were growing old. Their stories, of blips on radar screens, of false alarms and near launches, faded quietly into declassified archives and half-forgotten memoirs. But beneath the layers of official silence, one truth endured: humanity had survived not through superior weapons or flawless machines, but through hesitation, reason, and, at times, sheer luck. The balloon panic of 1955 had been absurd in its simplicity, yet profound in its consequence. It had shown how fragile the world truly was, how the smallest misunderstanding could ignite the fuse of Armageddon. A few specks of silver drifting on the jet stream had exposed the limits of technology and the dangers of fear disguised as vigilance. The incident forced both superpowers to confront the uncomfortable reality that their greatest threats might not come from the enemy's strength, but from their own mistakes. In the decades that followed, scientists and strategists built new systems designed to minimize those errors. Satellites replaced ground-based radar, computers replaced men with binoculars. The lines of communication between Washington and Moscow grew faster, more direct, more secure. Yet even as the hardware evolved, the human element remained stubbornly fragile. For every innovation that promised certainty, there was another incident that reminded the world of its fallibility: a computer glitch, a misplaced code, a warning light that refused to turn off. After the Soviet Union collapsed, many of the old radar sites were abandoned to snow and silence. Their domes, once glowing white against the Arctic horizon, dulled with frost and wind. Inside, consoles gathered dust, their screens blank, their circuits long cold. Nature reclaimed the listening posts that had once stood guard over civilization's survival. In Alaska, one of the original operators from the 1955 incident returned to visit the derelict site. He found the radar tower rusted, its stairwell filled with drifts of snow. Standing there, he remembered the night the world had nearly ended because of balloons, and how close his trembling hand had come to setting everything in motion. It was never the machines, he would later tell an interview. It was us. We built those systems thinking they'd save us, but they only worked because someone, somewhere, was willing to pause and think before pressing the button. His words captured the essence of a generation that had lived beneath the shadow of annihilation, ordinary people burdened with extraordinary responsibility, learning that survival often depended not on power, but on restraint. Today, the warnings come from different skies. Satellites monitor the heavens for missiles, drones patrol borders, algorithms analyze trajectories in milliseconds. Yet the same question lingers in every control room, every intelligence briefing, every server farm wired to early warning networks. What happens if the machines are wrong again? The more precise our systems become, the less room there is for doubt, and the more catastrophic a single false reading could be. Historians now look back on the Cold War's near misses with a mixture of awe and disbelief. They see them not merely as accidents, but as mirrors reflecting human nature, our genius for invention matched only by our capacity for error. Each event, from the phantom blips of Alaska to the moon mistaken for missiles, stands as a warning etched into history's memory. We are, and perhaps always will be, creatures of imperfect judgment living in a world built on perfect destruction. As the camera of history pulls back, the story of the balloon that caused the biggest panic in US history becomes something more than a tale of radar and fear. It becomes a parable about the limits of certainty, about the dangers of absolute trust in machines, and about the quiet heroism of doubt. High above the Arctic, the winds still move as they did 70 years ago, carrying invisible currents across the top of the world. Somewhere in that endless sky, alone where the balloon drifts through the pale light, silent and harmless, its silver skin flashing in the sun. It is a reminder of how close we once came to ending everything, and how, by some fragile grace, we didn't. History often celebrates the moments of courage that change the world. But in this story, salvation came not from courage, but from caution. The world was saved by hesitation, by the quiet decision to wait, to question, to look again. And in that pause, somewhere between fear and reason, humanity found its most precious defense.